Thank you, sir. Well. At last, I'm in the director's chair. Good morning. Oh, okay, yeah. Let me reassure you that I'm me. Here we go. Yes, as Ralph mentioned, and thank you for that kind introduction and for your invitation to do this presentation. As Ralph mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the history of Johns Hopkins renal pathology with a particular focus on the cast of characters involved in the service over the years. Okay, let me just
try hitting the right here. Sure.
And we'll be moving right along. Oh, okay, I guess next. Yeah, my disclosures, there are no relevant disclosures here. It's going to be tedious, but that's okay. And the presentation objectives are related to the title, the history of Johns Hopkins pathology and the people who've been involved. And here we see Robert Heptinstall. This talk is dedicated to Bob Heptinstall, who passed away last spring at the ripe old age of 100. And he was a very important mentor to me and many others. But the story really begins mid-century, in the 20th century, with Arnold Rich. And here we see him in full academic regalia. Rich was a Southerner. He received his AB and master's degree from the University of Virginia and his MD from Johns Hopkins, where he was very inspired by William McCallum and was recruited to pathology. He had a wide variety of research interests over the years, which impressed Heppy greatly, but especially infection, inflammation, and hypersensitivity, including polyarteritis nodosa and types of glomerulonephritis. And it was in these areas where he and his coworkers made very important contributions to our understanding of the role of antigen-antibody complexes in these various diseases. Rich was made professor in 1944 and became chair in 1947. And the man accumulated an amazing array of honors over the years. He was a member of the National Academy of Science in the US, a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor, an honorary fellow of the British Royal Society, and also served as chair of the Medical Advisory Board of the AFIP. He received a number of honorary doctorates and received the Cobra Medal and the Trudeau Medal, many of these recognizing his work with tuberculosis. After a little over a decade, he stepped away from the chairmanship as an emeritus professor. But even in his retirement, he chaired a symposium on renal biopsy, which was a new technology at the time. Now, Rich and his wife were very interested in the arts. His wife was a pianist and composer. Rich himself played chamber music and played in the same chamber ensemble with H.L. Mencken. He was very well connected socially in Baltimore. One of their daughters became a poet, another a writer. And they hosted the department for many events at their home, including regular journal club. And apparently after they finished discussing the journal article, they would have a soiree with music and libations. So the early history of modern renal pathology. The earliest renal pathology, of course, was based on autopsy or surgical specimens. But in 1944, there was a description of very early renal biopsy. And by 1951, other centers had published results with this technique. But these were essentially aspiration biopsies with very, very small sample. Shortly thereafter, a cutting needle was introduced and tissue cores were obtained. And this really transformed the field. By 1955, immunofluorescence had been applied to renal tissue. And by 1957, there was a first description of EM changes in glomerular disease. And as I mentioned, by 1961, there was enough accumulated material that a SIVA symposium was organized, chaired by Arnold Rich. Interestingly, an important part of the history of renal biopsy at Hopkins was this individual, Jack Yardley. Jack and Jerry Spear were training at the same time and both interested in kidney pathology. Ivan Bennett was the chair at the time. Jack in particular was very interested in electron microscopy. There was no electron microscope in the Department of Pathology, so he began to use the EM scope in medicine, specifically GI. And by then, EM had been used to examine GI, liver, and kidney specimens. In 1961, Yardley and Tom Hendricks described EM findings in Whipple's disease. Ivan Bennett decided that Jack would come onto the faculty in GI pathology and Jerry Spear would do renal, and John Boitnott would do liver. And as you all know, Jack and John stayed on the faculty for decades for their entire illustrious careers and actually were co-directors of the department. And here is Jerry Spear. You can see he's a very affable fellow sitting at his microscope. With him is Joanne Alsrud. Joanne was a technician with Jerry Spear here at Hopkins, and ultimately went to Bayview when Gary Hill ran the renal biopsy facility there. Unfortunately, Jerry Spear passed away this past year as well. He came to pathology as a resident in the early 1950s, and in 1959 joined the pathology faculty, and as you heard, was appointed to the renal pathology service. In 1964, he published his first article describing the mesangial pattern of staining on IF, and this was really a cardinal observation. In 1965, he had seen enough material that he published an overview of the pathology of renal biopsies. In 1971, he described the renal pathology in the lysosomal storage disease cystinosis. And in 1972, described the distinctive glomerular basement membrane changes in Alport syndrome. So these were all very, very significant contributions to this young field. Unfortunately, in 1977, he was recruited as professor to UC Irvine. Jerry and his wife enjoyed traveling. As you saw, he was a very affable fellow, very interested in history, a wonderful raconteur. He actually came to the virtual rounds at the renal biopsy, the pathology reunion last year, and had a number of amusing anecdotes about the early days at Hopkins. He was a very well-regarded teacher, and in 2005, a medical student pathology fellowship was established at Johns Hopkins. These are the log books from the first specimens of immunofluorescence on the left and EM on the right, and you can see below the first images from those first cases. Robert Heptinstall was attracted to Hopkins by Arnold Rich. He had received his MD at Charing Cross in 1943 and was swept into the British Army in World War II. He served in the Burma theater and actually parachuted into Burma and a couple of other countries to treat soldiers and people liberated from prisoner of war camps. And this really affected his worldview in later years. He was out of the Army in 1947 and returned to Charing Cross, announcing that he no longer wanted to train in surgery, but he wanted to train in pathology. And people were not very friendly to this at Charing Cross. And so he went to St. Mary's to train and developed an early interest in research as well as diagnostics of renal disease. And in the mid-1950s came as a fellow to work with Arnold Rich and Fred Germuth at Hopkins. In 1960, he arrived at Hopkins as a visiting professor of pathology. And in 1962, he returned to join the faculty. He saw a fair amount of renal biopsy material at Hopkins, but had access as well to Georgetown. A prominent nephrologist there reviewed case materials with Heppy, and he had seen enough material that he was able to publish the pathology of the kidney which was the first textbook to include renal biopsy findings. And this is now in its 7th edition and is now known as Heptinstall's Pathology of the Kidney. Shortly after he published this text, he became acting director of pathology, and in 1967 was appointed Baxley Professor and director of the department. He continued his research and trained several fellows during that time, and in 1976, directed the renal biopsy service with the departure of Jerry Spear. These are images from the Pathology of the Kidney first edition. And you can see that although there were some chapter contributions by John Cassane and Ken Porter on development and renal transplantation, the rest of the book was all Heppy. So it reflects his tremendous range of knowledge on the topic, but also his wit and humor. And it makes a really good read, actually. This is a picture of the pathology faculty in 1968, around the time that Heppy took over as chair. And you can see that there are no women in the picture. Heptinstall's research interests were in atherosclerosis, hypertension, renal infection. Arnold Rich had thought that the government was not the place to find support for medical research, but Heppy felt otherwise, and has actually worked with NIH grants, actually was on and chaired NIH study section. He was appointed editor-in-chief of Laboratory Investigation, which is a tremendous time commitment on his part. He was also very active in large societies of nephrology, and his high profile as a nepropathologist in those societies has led to a continued relationship that continues to this day. He was vice president and then president of the American Society of Nephrology and vice president of the International Society of Nephrology as well. The Renal Pathology Club, which was an early interest group, morphed into the Renal Pathology Society, and he served as its first president. He received a number of awards over the years, including the David Hume Award from the National Kidney Foundation, the Jean Hamburger Award from the ISN. And a few years ago, Bob Heptinstall established the Renal Pathology Society Lifetime Achievement Award. And there is a Renal Heptinstall Pathology Fellowship at Hopkins as well. This is my favorite picture of Heppy. You can see the mischievous smile there. He was a wonderful raconteur with a great sense of humor. He knew everyone who of any importance in pathology and nephrology and told wonderful stories about them. His wife had come with him from England and they had 5 children. They lost a child early in life, and another son, Christopher, developed a midbrain tumor as a child, and over the years suffered from side effects of therapy and a gradual regrowth of the tumor. I had always thought that, like his mentor, Arnold Rich, Heppy didn't like exercise, but he told me that he and Christopher walked the trails at Loch Raven Reservoir every Saturday for years and years. And so he basically has hiked thousands of miles over the years. He also is a pipe smoker, loved baseball, stayed current with current events, and was basically a wonderful fellow well into his last years. Heppy trained a number of fellows, and the first of these, and the man that he regarded as his son, was Gary Hill. Gary is a Texan. He went to Rice University for undergraduate studies, but came to Hopkins in the late 60s to receive his medical degree. Even as a medical student, he worked in the Heptinstall's lab and went on to do a residency and a renal pathology fellowship at Hopkins. His research overlapped with those of Heppy, atherosclerosis and hypertension, but he also had an interest in chronic kidney disease and was one of the people who organized the schema for grading of lupus nephritis. He had a service commitment and then went to the University of Pennsylvania for a few years, but came back in 1980 as professor and chair and chief of pathology at Bayview, where he served for a couple of decades. He was a longtime francophone and francophile, and he went as a visiting professor to a prominent hospital in Paris. and stayed there, as it turned out. He mentored many individuals there, pathologists and nephrologists, and began to publish in the field of transplantation. He also published a French-English urology dictionary and received the Jacob Churg Award from the Renal Pathology Society for his contributions to the field. And Gary was a very jovial individual. He never quite lost his Texas drawl. He and his wife, Martha, traveled extensively, particularly to Paris, to their apartment there in later years, but also to Mexico and many other places throughout the world. He loved the arts, photography, film. He had a tremendous range of knowledge, knew a great deal about the history of France and of Paris, and was just a good person to get to know. Hosted a number of visitors from Hopkins over the years at his apartment in Paris. He also liked birds and had birds in his apartment in his office at Bayview and his apartment in Paris. Another Heptinstall fellow was Kim Solez. Kim graduated from Oberlin and received his MD at the University of Rochester before coming to Hopkins as a resident and renal pathology fellow in 1973. His research focused on acute kidney injury and transplant pathology. He's widely published, and he joined the Hopkins faculty after completing his fellowship. In 1983, he was promoted to associate professor and director of the renal biopsy service. Unfortunately, he was lured away in 1987 to become professor and pathology chair and director of anatomic pathology at the University of Alberta. Kim loved music. He's a good singer. He and his wife Elaine have 3 sons, and Elaine is a force in her own right. She was president of the Baltimore chapter of NOW while they were in Baltimore. Another Heptinstall fellow was Jean Olson. Jean was from the Boston area, attended Mount Holyoke, and was a very active alumna of that institution, and received her MD shortly after Kim Solez from the University of Rochester. She came to do her residency and renal pathology fellowship at Hopkins. And in 1978 to 1980, she was a fellow at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where she worked in the laboratory of a very prominent nephrologist, Barry Brenner. She returned to Hopkins in 1980 as assistant and then associate professor, and directed the IF and EM laboratories. In 1987, with Kim's departure, she became director of the renal biopsy service. Now, Jean pointed out gender salary discrepancies to the dean, and this helped trigger an institutional investigation of this issue and others, and led to the formation of the Women's Leadership Council and ultimately the Office of Women in Science and Medicine at Hopkins. So she's obviously an important mentor and role model for me. She also had a fine voice. She sang with the BSO chorus. She was an early adopter of technology. She was the first person I knew who used Windows, and the first person I knew who was a computer gamer. She was a rabid Red Sox fan. She was also active in her church, was an elder in her church in Baltimore, and received an award from the Girl Scouts for her volunteer work. So here's the first timeline. And as you see here, Jerry Spear kicks things off at the beginning of the 1960s. Bob Heptinstall comes shortly thereafter. Kim Solez and Jean Olson come to train toward the end of the 1970s and join the faculty. And here's the house staff, 1979, 1980. And I'm not, yes, I have a cursor here. This is me. And here we are flanking Heptinstall. I'm an intern. This was the other woman in my intern year, Liz Laposada. And as you see, by this time, there are a few women in the senior residency ranks. In the back is Steve Wilson. Steve was also a fellow with Heptinstall. He was a research fellow and was never involved in the diagnostic service. He ultimately went to the University of Galveston. And then there's me. I was a fellow of Kim Solez, so I'm an academic granddaughter, if you will, of Heptinstall. I'm a Vermonter, and actually received my undergraduate and medical degrees from the University of Vermont, and then accompanied my husband to Yale, where we were both postdoctoral research fellows. I came to Hopkins in 1979 as a resident and then did a renal pathology fellowship. In 1983, I joined the faculty as assistant professor, and my interests were those of my mentor, or shared by my mentor, acute kidney injury and transplant pathology, with a number of publications. In 1994, with Jean Olson's departure to UCSF, I became director of the renal biopsy service and the affiliated laboratories, and retired a few years ago. Now here we have a picture of the pathology faculty around the time just before I joined the faculty. And I wanted to point out, and there are some house staff here as well in the background. So there are a few females, Virginia Donovan and others, but notice Jean Olson, Pat Sharash, and Risa Mann. And these were the senior role models, if you will, for junior faculty at the time. And I wanted to speak a little bit more about these individuals. Ella Oppenheimer was on the pathology faculty for many years. She was from a prominent Baltimore family. She was married, had children, but managed to pursue her academic career. I went out of my way to sign an autopsy out with her as an intern. Pat Sharash had joint appointments in pathology and medicine. She and her husband, Sam, had trained at Hopkins and remained there for decades on the faculty. Pat played leadership roles in both pathology and medicine. She went out of her way to foster junior faculty and trainees, and I remember going to her home for some female networking over the years. She was very well known in the field of infectious disease, traveled widely establishing laboratories and doing quality assurance laboratories, a role which she played well past her retirement in the department. Risa Mann was closer in age to the junior trainees, a very elegant woman married to a Hopkins physician. They had 2 daughters. She was a hematopathologist, actually went, after she served as chief resident at Hopkins in pathology, she went to NIH and did a fellowship there before returning to the department. She rose to the rank of professor, spent time in the dean's office, and was actually a very effective leader for almost 2 decades of the renal pathology training program. Kim Solez had departed when we last saw him to become professor and pathology chair at the University of Alberta. And he had a number of major roles to play in the International Society of Nephrology. Like Heppy, he was very active in the nephrology community and chaired the ISN Commission on Acute Renal Failure for a number of years. And very importantly, in 1991, organized the first Banff Symposium on renal allograft pathology. And this was a small meeting. There were 16 or 17 of us, actually, and we developed a schema, a sort of a consensus agreement on a schema for diagnosis of rejection in the kidney. This meeting, which is held every other year, has now grown tremendously. It now includes heart, liver, lung, pancreas, composite tissues, many working sessions, many working groups that continue to work between the meetings, and many publications have emerged from that meeting. Here is one of those publications. I'm first author on this, the Banff 97 Working Classification of Renal Allograft Pathology, which has been very widely cited. In 1992, Kim became director of experimental pathology at the University of Alberta. He was an early adopter of telemedicine and has run the online nephrol discussion group for decades. He also continues to have an interest in music. He became a rabid Leonard Cohen fan, organized a Leonard Cohen festival in Edmonton, and has become a poet. So if you visit his website, he bills himself as pathologist by day and poet by night. Fred Sanfillipo was recruited as Jack Yardley and John Voigtnott were finishing their joint leadership of the department. Fred was also a renal pathologist. So for much of my career at Hopkins, I had a renal pathologist as the department chair. Fred received his BS and MS in physics at the University of Pennsylvania before going to Duke, where he spent many years. He got his MD and PhD in immunology at Duke, did a residency in pathology, and in 1979 was appointed to the faculty, where he rose to the rank of professor, pathology, immunology, and surgery. And in 1993 was recruited to Hopkins to chair the department. He had quite a mandate when he arrived. Heptinstall had always wanted to unite anatomic pathology and clinical pathology, but the powers that be never really moved forward on that. So Fred was able to accomplish that. In addition, he brought a lot of the outlying laboratories throughout Hopkins under the pathology umbrella, at least most of them. His research was in transplantation pathology, many articles, 3 patents, over $30 million in funding. In 1996, he decided to step away from the biopsy service. He had actually served 25% time, even as the chair, but decided to step away in 1996, which led to the recruitment of Tibor Nadasdy. Fred went on, as you know, to Ohio State, where he was dean and CEO and senior vice president. And in 2008, he was recruited to Emory in the Department of Health Policy. And he now directs the Emory Georgia Tech Healthcare Cell Therapy Regenerative Medicine initiatives. Fred is a very charming fellow, really enjoyed administration. Heptinstall never enjoyed administration and was very frank about it. Fred, on the other hand, really enjoyed it, was also an entrepreneur. And he and his wife hosted pathology events at their gracious home in North Baltimore. And he also collected vintage phonographs. Jean Olson, as I mentioned, was a major mentor for me. She was recruited away in 1994 to UCSF as a full professor and directed the EM laboratory and the autopsy service. She also served in the academic senate at UCSF and was on the editorial board of Kidney International. And she is now one of the 4 editors of Heptinstall's Pathology of the Kidney. And here we see Jean at the one of the early electron microscopes. And with her are Barbara Plantholt and Gerald Horn. They were longtime technicians in the electron microscopy lab. Not shown are Marilyn Miller, who was also a longtime EM tech, had begun her career as a research technician in Bob Heptinstall's lab, and Pam Cady, who directed the immunofluorescence laboratory for many years. Jean was also active at UCSF, was a regular attendee at the Symphony, of course, very interested in classical music. She also served as an elder in her church there, and as we all know, was a cat lover. We trained a number of renal pathology fellows over the years. In 2004, we actually established an ACGME-accredited fellowship program. But we trained a number of fellows before that. The first of these that I interacted with was Randy Henniger, who is shown here. The single asterisk indicates those individuals that ended up in academia. The double asterisk shows those that ultimately joined the Hopkins faculty. And here we see Serena Bagnasco and Tibor Nadasdy, who will appear shortly. Tibor Nadasdy came to us from Oklahoma, but he received his MD in his home country of Hungary. He trained in pathology at the University of Medicine in Szeged and received his PhD in pathology in 1991 on the topic of pathology of rejection. He shortly thereafter went as a visiting fellow to the University of Oklahoma for a year. But as you can see from the dates, Fred Silva really glommed onto him, recognizing his intellect, his work ethic, his broad knowledge base, and kept him on as a fellow. So when Fred decided to step away from the biopsy service and we started calling around to see if there were any fellows who we might consider bringing onto the faculty, Fred Silva strongly recommended Tibor. So he came to us in 1995 to help cover what was a growing biopsy service and came as kind of a super resident. He had never trained in pathology in the States. And so he had a number of resident rotations that he had to complete before he was board eligible. And so he served as a sort of super resident fellow in renal pathology for a year passed its boards, and joined the faculty in 1996. His research interests are in renal and transplant pathology. In 1999, he was promoted to associate professor and director of the EM laboratory, but unfortunately was recruited away to the University of Rochester and is now a professor of pathology at OSU, where he directs renal and transplant pathology. Tibor never lost his Transylvania accent. He used to answer the telephone, "Hello, I am Tibor." He and his wife, Jean also trained as an MD in Hungary and did not retrain in the US, but served as a physician's assistant in the pathology department in surgical pathology, renal pathology, and she was a tremendous help in the education initiative, preparing specimens, digitizing case materials, etc. And she played that role as well at the University of Rochester and for a time at OSU. Tibor and Jean had 2 daughters and a grandson. They've always enjoyed camping and the outdoors and currently have a lovely home on the shores of the lake in Ohio. With Tibor's departure, we desperately needed someone of stature to come and join us, and we were able to recruit Mark Haas to join us. He received his undergraduate MD and PhD degrees from Duke and trained as a resident and fellow in renal pathology at Yale before joining the faculty at Yale, where he served for about 3 years before being recruited to the University of Chicago. He rose to the rank of Associate Professor of Pathology and Medicine at the University of Chicago and was recruited by us in 1999 to Johns Hopkins as Associate Professor and was then promoted to Professor. In 2004, as I stepped away from full-time commitment, he became Director of the Renal Biopsy Service. Mark has a major profile in 2 major areas of renal pathology: IgA nephropathy, which is the most common form of glomerulonephritis worldwide, and he has helped develop the schema for grading and for grading severity of IgA nephropathy. And he has also become very active in renal transplant pathology. He's active in the BANF meetings and the BANF initiative, has been on the program committee, etc. He received awards from the Jacob Churg Award from the Renal Pathology Society and is associate editor of the American Journal of Transplantation, the most prestigious journal in the field. Unfortunately, in 2009, he was recruited away to Cedars-Sinai. Mark was an avid golfer. He golfed for Duke, but continued that passion when he was here in Baltimore, appearing in a number of fundraising golf tournaments. He also is a coin collector. He and his wife, Lisa, who is trained in social work, have 2 sons. It's no secret that one of those sons is autistic. Mark has talked about this publicly and has talked about most recently in an interview with the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Renal Pathology Society. And that is one of the reasons that they moved to California to get more resources for their son. So here we have the timeline from 1980 to 2000. We can see Heptinstall is still there like an angel in the sky. Kim Solez was there until the late 80s. Jean Olson left in the mid-1990s. I arrive as a junior person and stay throughout these 2 decades. Fred Sanfillipo arrives, and then we recruit Tibor Nadasdy. And at the turn of the decade and the turn of the century, actually, we bring Mark Haas on board. I had mentioned that we had established an ACGME-accredited fellowship. This was the first ACGME renal pathology fellowship in the US. There are now 7 of them. I was chair of the training program committee for the Renal Pathology Society when we began to consider whether we should have certification for our fellowship programs. The large academic centers were training fellows from the US and from many from abroad, but we had no formal fellowship programs. And so I decided to be the first one, and I pressed forward. We were very concerned about having to maintain board exams. But it turns out that there are a number of ACGME-accredited programs that do not have boards, and renal pathology is one of them. Our program required American Pathology Board eligibility or certification. We wanted to train people for the states. It included laboratory management as well as training in all of the modalities for evaluation of biopsies, because most renal pathologists run EM and IF laboratories. And it included grading progression to supervise and then independent on-call responsibilities. The renal biopsy service has always had major on-call responsibilities, night call, weekend call, and holidays. And in addition, there are same-day rushes most days. There are at least one and up to 7. So the time commitment is major, and the fellows were a tremendous help. So since we established the fellowship, we trained a number of pathologists. Once again, we can see that essentially all of them ended up in academia, and a couple of them, Naima Carter-Monroe and Avi Rosenberg, ultimately joined the Hopkins faculty. Sadhna Kaul did a surgical pathology fellowship after training with us, but then wanted to stay in the Washington area and went to work for the FDA. So Mark and I were very busy. The service was growing, and we decided we needed help. So we recruited Serena Bagnasco. Serena is from Genoa and received her medical degree there at the University of Genoa, and then came with her husband as a visiting scientist to NIH, where she worked in the molecular physiology laboratories in NIDDK with some prominent renal physiologists. She decided to stay in the States and did her Housestaff training in pathology at Northwestern, and then did a renal pathology fellowship with us, and then was recruited to Emory. In 2008, she was recruited to Johns Hopkins as associate professor. And in 2009, when Mark Haas departed for Cedars-Sinai, she became director of the renal biopsy service. Her research has morphed a bit over the years: molecular physiology, transplant pathology, digital pathology, glomerular disease. And she's the lead pathologist for the HOPE study, which investigates HIV-positive renal transplants. She was promoted to professor last year. She's on the editorial board of the American Journal of Physiology, an academic editor of PLOS ONE, and has served the Renal Pathology Society and is currently counselor of that society. She's also been on the medical advisory board of the National Kidney Foundation. Serena is very elegant, very Italian. She's an excellent cook. She's very interested in classic films and recommends the Charles Theater highly. She's also a member and regular visitor to the Baltimore Museum of Art and attends the symphony. And she has fostered cats. With Mark Haas's departure, Serena and I had a rather desperate year covering the service before we were able to recruit Lois Arend to join us. Lois is from Michigan, received her MD and PhD from the University of Michigan, and did her residency and fellowship in pathology at Michigan State. She was then a visiting scientist at NIH for a few years. In 1999, joined the University of Rochester faculty. In 2004, she was recruited to the University of Cincinnati as associate professor and was recruited to Hopkins in 2010. She currently directs the Renal Pathology Fellowship and directs the Departmental Pathology Clinical Fellowship programs. Her research is in renal development, acute kidney injury, and transplant pathology. She serves as ISN Educational Ambassador. She's the only person I know who has actually been to Mongolia. She's been active in the Renal Pathology Society, was treasurer for several years, and is currently counselor of the society. She and her partner, Scott, are triathletes, and they have a killer exercise room over their garage at their home in North Baltimore. They're also dog lovers. They arrived in Baltimore with 2 enormous Great Danes, and she's also an excellent cook. One of the technical advances over the years was the embedding of digital images into our renal pathology reports. We had a lot of outside clients who did not have direct access to a lot of the case materials for review, And so we felt that it was important to do this for their benefit. And a few of the large academic centers and the few private labs were already starting to do this. It took a great deal of effort by the informatics and PDS staff to manage doing this. And we accomplished it, many thanks to them. And the first report with digital images was actually released in 2011, and Dr. Bagnasco signed out this case. And here we have a page from that report with all identifiers removed, of course, but you can see that we could include, when relevant, both light immunofluorescence and electron microscopy. So the technology advantages over the years on the renal pathology service, like all of the divisions, we now have multi-headed light microscope with digital camera for teaching and clinical conferencing. And this became quite important when the renal pathology service at Bayview was subsumed into the Hopkins service. So this was a service to the Bayview clinicians. The IF scope and the EM scopes were fitted with digital cameras. And as I said, we were able to embed those digital images in our case reports. So here's high tech. Here we have the multi-headed light microscope and some of the players. Here's myself as I approach retirement. And here's Naima Carter-Monroe, who was recruited in anticipation of my departure. Here we see Drs. Bagnasco and Arend, and our fellow at the time, Avi Rosenberg. Here is Lois Anderson, who for many years was the administrator for all of the renal pathology affiliated laboratories. Nora worked in the immunofluorescence laboratory. Ed Roberts is the lead tech in EM, and here we see some of the EM staff. And here was our fellow at the time, Mario, and another fellow as well. And of course, the accessioners. Here we are at the electron microscope, again with the digital camera, digital images. And here we see Drs. Bagnasco and Aaron flanking Dion Hicks. DJ is a member of the large Hicks clan, many of whom have worked at Hopkins. Naima Carter-Monroe got her MD from Howard University in 2001 and did her residency at the University of Maryland, where she served as chief resident. She then got a degree in health science informatics from Hopkins, and we brought her on board as a renal pathology fellow in 2012. She was recruited in 2013 as assistant professor to the Hopkins faculty. Unfortunately, she was recruited back into the Maryland system a few years later at the Baltimore VA hospital, where she does renal and autopsy and forensic pathology. She was a joy to work with, a very pleasant individual, 3 charming children. And she left us for regular hours and better pay. Go figure. And now we return to moi. I served as longtime director of the Pathology Corps and the Year 2 medical student curriculum, a major initiative, and with a lot of help from Jean Nadasdy and Barbara Crane, who co-directed the course with me. I have a large number of publications and done a lot of traveling nationally and internationally to give invited talks throughout the world. I love to travel. I was a co-organizer for many years of the Banff Symposia. I was on an editorial board of the Journal of American Society of Nephrology, served on NIH study sections. I have also been very active with the Renal Pathology Society as committee member, ultimately counselor, vice president, and president. I have received awards from the Renal Pathology Society, the Churg Award, and was very thrilled and humbled to receive the Heptinstall Lifetime Achievement Award recently. In the ASN, I've served on committees and I'm a fellow of the ASN, and Kim Solez and I received the gold medal from the Spanish Society of Nephrology a few years ago. I retired in 2014, but with Dr. Carter-Monroe's departure, I returned briefly to cover service in 2016. And here again, we have the crew. Here we see more of the reference laboratory staff, as well as all of the EM and IF folks, and of course, the faculty. We were able to recruit Avi Rosenberg. So I was able to retire once again, to re-retire. Avi received his MD from SUNY Stony Brook at 2011, where he was in the medical scientist training program, and did his residency at NIH, where he was co-chief resident. He was interested in kidney pathology, and NIH really didn't have the breadth of material that he felt he needed to see. So he came to us in 2015 for a renal pathology fellowship. He then departed in 2016 for a pediatric pathology fellowship. This was during the period when I returned to help cover service before we were able to recruit him back to Hopkins. His research is in cell and molecular biology, fibrosis, and the role of APOL1 in diseases. He has been active in the Renal Pathology Society and received their Gary S. Hill Research Award. And he's on the perinatal path committee of the Society of Pediatric Pathology. He's a brilliant guy, very hardworking. He and his wife, Ariella, have between them 9 children. So needless to say, he's a busy man. They're gardeners. He's very active in his synagogue and in Jewish charities, and he plays the drums. Since my retirement, we've trained a number of renal pathology fellows who have ended up in academia. And I hope that this talk has convinced you that this is really a team effort to run the renal pathology service, relying on the histology laboratory, biopsy intake and triage, the immunofluorescence and EM laboratories, the laboratory coordinator, who for many years was Lois Anderson, the renal pathology administrator, of whom I will speak shortly. Path photography has played an enormous role, among other things, providing the vintage photographs for this talk, but also for many years, our documentation of immunofluorescence cases was by Kodachrome and our EM material via film. So they actually provided all of that archival material. Informatics has played an extremely important role for us as for other parts of the department. And then, of course, there are other clients and collaborators, adult and pediatric nephrologists, transplant physicians, and rheumatologists. I wanted to speak particularly about Marion Eggleston. Marion came in the early years of my faculty stint here, arrived as a renal pathology administrative assistant, absorbed every piece of computer technology that we could throw at her, and became incredibly important in running the academic programs and the pathology course for the medical students. In 2003, she was appointed academic program coordinator and promoted to senior academic program coordinator in 2007. And she's the longtime administrator of renal pathology. She's the Mabel Smith of renal pathology. Basically, she runs. She's also an extremely affable, good-natured, loyal, an extremely dedicated individual. She has 3 children and a number of grandchildren here in Baltimore. So here we have my final timeline. We can see Heptinstall stepped away as service professor around 2010. I stayed on until 2014. I think Heptinstall sets the record for longevity, but I'm close. Mark Haas came and joined us, but left for Cedars-Sinai. Serena Bagnasco and Lois Arend and Avi Rosenberg are with us and run the renal biopsy service. And Naima Carter-Monroe was with us for a few years. I also wanted to mention my home team. This is my husband of 52 years. We were married as undergraduates. Here we are on our wedding day. Here we are when we graduated from graduate school. He got his PhD, I got my MD. And here we are last year in California, visiting our sons and grandchildren, and here they are. Here's my older son, Christopher, who's an engineer, with his youngest daughter, Alice, and his older daughter, Lucy. And here they are with mom, Michelle, who is also an engineer. Here's my younger son, who is an accountant and business consultant, Darren, with his wife, Shakti. And here he is holding our grand dog, Gracie. And with that, I want to thank you very much for the invitation and thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lorraine. That was simply wonderful. I apologize for the technical challenges at the beginning. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll answer them. Lorraine, I wanted to ask about kind of themes that run through across the years, and one that strikes me is kind of promulgation of the training, the trainees who go into academics, and then the faculty who are here and then go elsewhere and lead renal pathology elsewhere. So kind of fostering the message of Hopkins renal pathology across the country. What do you think are the broad themes of the division and the group?
Well, I think service. You have to say service is a major theme. As I said, it's a very demanding service, a major time commitment. There have been a few of us who have children, but not many. It's a very demanding service. I missed a lot of birthdays, Mother's Days, etc., as many professional women do, of course. And I think our aim in establishing the fellowship was also training people to serve, to be very, very knowledgeable diagnosticians, and of course, to be academic as well. And I do feel that we have a proud tradition, and we're very conscious of that tradition and carrying it forward. And I know that people, all of the people who've been on the service are very proud of the service. We are competing with a few private laboratories now that are very large, and it's a little difficult for academic centers to compete, but we have ramped up our turnaround times and embedded images into our case reports and really tried to keep up with the field, if you will. And of course, our research is collaborative, and we've worked with the transplanters and the nephrologists quite closely. The nephrology division here, there's one individual who does a lot of investigation of acute kidney injury. And so as you see, a number of us have become involved in those initiatives, but most of the nephrology division have been basically public health, epidemiology folks. And so it's a little harder for us to plug in with that. So it's really been the transplanters and the nephrologists where our research interests have laid to this point. Avi, of course, is carrying things forward.
Thank you. And there's some, I don't know if you can see them, there's some wonderful notes in the chat, many from people who've been here in the past, from Carla Ellis, Rob Kale, Mark Haas has a nice note, Jerome Taxi also.
Yeah, I saw Jerry Taxi's note. Hi, Jerry. Yeah, I remember Jerry very fondly, actually. And all of those folks. Carla Ellis, we've been interacting with Carla Ellis. She is very prominent in the renal pathology community. She's now at Northwestern, and she heads the diversity and inclusion committee. And I had mentioned that Mark Haas had done a recent interview related to his son's autism. And Rob Call, I mean, as I said, I've been at Hopkins forever, so I know almost everybody who's still with us, shall we say. I remember Ralph Rupan when he was trained, my junior, if you will.
Another nice note from Chuck White and
yes.
Tom Bauer. So.
Yes. And Tommy Bauer was one of the people, was a co-intern with me. And of course, Chuck White, his wife, he's one of the funniest people in the world.
Well, listen, Lorraine, thank you so very much. We really appreciate it. And congratulations to you on just a extraordinary, impactful career. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward
really
to hearing your talk later on about your new book. So, and thank you for letting me use your computer.
Great. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.